So here we are, Ayurvedic psychology and digestion. So for those that don't know, my name is Naina. You may have been following on my profile. So I'll just introduce very quickly about myself on a career level. So I started off as a pharmacist, and then I noticed that there's lots of gaps missing in our health system. And I went on that journey to discover what impacts our health a little bit more than just what we were doing in our mainstream healthcare systems. And that led me down in parallel with a spiritual path as well. And I ended up studying yoga and Ayurveda and discovering all the answers that I needed to get for what I was searching for through these sciences. And so I now work in teaching Ayurveda. And I think my background in pharmacy helps me to deliver it in a more in a way that we can understand it, because it's coming through that background of the Western science first. And so what I do now is, at the moment, I'm doing workshops, teaching, and slowly going back to consultations as well. I am more along the lines of Vedic counseling at the moment. So that means that I've gone into understanding the deeper, subtle aspects of the mind and how it affects our body. So you'll see that if you do attend more of these seminars and you follow me, you'll see that I do always relate everything back to the mind and spirit, because these seem to be the sources of many of our issues. And so when we can correct that and purify it, our outer circumstances, our physical body, it kind of all follows and improves. I'm passionate about Ayurveda and Vedic psychology because really I think the main thing that is so important with these sciences is that it banishes ignorance. And if we observe, ignorance is one of the things that really it's a tough thing. So in the Vedic language, avidya is what we would call that. Avidya is when there is not proper knowledge of the self. And so we live in limitation. We have our own opinions and ideas. We don't see ourselves as part of a whole. We see ourselves as a bit separate. And so I feel that is one of the root causes of much of our suffering. It comes down to this avidya. And so what I found with Ayurveda and Vedic psychology is that they add light. And what that does is it reduces ignorance, whether that's ignorance when we are interacting with the world, or whether that's ignorance within our own self, with our wrong thoughts. And just that addition of light where it's needed, it helps us on so many levels. And it covers not just our own physical health, it affects people around us. And then that also affects our actions and our thoughts, which then changes the way that we interact with the world. And therefore, we're going to be more conscious about how we look after the environment and how we do things. So there's a follow-on to this. It's not just, I want to make everybody healthy. There is a bigger scope to learning these sciences and having some knowledge around it. So how many people have we got on our thing? I won't do introductions of everybody today because we're on record at the moment. But like I said, if we do make this a regular thing, if you enjoy this webinar and the regular people come along, we should, we can start to get to know each other. And I'll cut the recording and we can have a discussion if you would like. So just a couple of housekeeping things about this webinar. If you could keep yourself on mute, that would be great. There will be time for questions if possible, there is time for questions. I don't mind questions at the end. But if we go on more than 1 hour 15, then I'll probably have to ask you to put them in an email or contact me personally. And the recording is on there. Okay, so like I said at the beginning, if there's any issue with your name appearing on this, please let me know. Right. Okay. So the outline for the session. So this is more like a whistle-stop tour, okay, of what some things you can think about. So you can just have a taste of these things that affect our digestion, not just looking at our original things that we go to, like herbs or diet change. And so I won't go into great detail on each of these topics, but there'll be many offerings that I put on that will go further into them. Or, you know, if you want to go into a deeper inquiry for yourself, we can arrange a consultation. This webinar is designed for beginners as much as it is for more advanced people on the topic. So just to make you aware that I will have to explain the basic topics in a brief way often, so that people that are new to Ayurveda have an idea and can follow on. Okay, so why is this topic important? So when we are talking about our digestion, we often really hone in on what am I eating and can I take something for it? So any digestion issue, that's the first thing we think of, isn't it? Shall I have some herbs? Shall I have a tea? What shall I take out of my diet, right? I've had many situations and circumstances with clients where they've been doing this for a long time. And what can happen is that the diet gets very, very limited. So in the end, you end up cutting out foods. You can't go out to restaurants with your friends because they're going to somewhere that has, you know, there's nothing on the menu that suits you, or you might get a stomach issue with certain foods and you're worried about that, so you don't go out. Our cupboards become full of all of these kind of specialty foods, which cost a lot of money as well. And so do the herbs that we need to correct our Agni. So as much as it does help, changing the diet and having herbs are the key things we can do to help our digestion. However, there are other aspects that you can work on that are free. You don't have to buy them at all. You just have to be aware. So these are what we're going to be talking about in today's session. So working on the subtle level of our being has a bigger impact on our health and well-being rather than solely on the physical. So what do I mean by that? If you may know already, there is something called the 5 koshas, which are the 5 layers of our body. So according to Ayurveda and yogic sciences, we don't just have a physical body. There is a mental layer, there is a pranic layer, and a more subtle layers. And there's 5 of them. When we work with these different levels, like the mind kosha or the prana kosha, I'll explain what prana is for those that are not aware of it yet. When we work on those levels or those bodies, you could say, it has a more lasting and impactful effect on our health and well-being. Whereas if you start to control and you start fixing your digestion issues just from diet and herbs, you make a difference, but nowhere near as big a difference as it would be if you worked on the subtle layers. Because according to Vedic understanding, we are all light. So this physical body is not even who we are, we could say. And so when we are understanding ourselves in that way, if our true identity is a spark of light, our most subtle version of ourselves is the source of who we are. So the more that we come back to that, the more that we come back to truth. And that's why working on our subtle layers purifies us from a place of source. Whereas when we keep trying to control and fix our physical nature by becoming too analytical, too obsessive with our physical world that we interact with, we're almost playing with untruth, which will always, it will keep you there. You have to buy more foods, you have to spend more money, you have to go for more herbs. It doesn't have a sustaining effect. So when we work on our subtle layers, when we work on our mind, our spirit, and our prana, we are working from the inside out rather than the outside in. And this is a different approach to our conventional medical systems. Thirdly, these things or these extra aspects of our digestion have a sustaining effect. So chronic Agni problems will return if we do not control the outer circumstances. And if anybody is in this webinar is suffering from chronic Agni problems, I mean, I think all of us, there are many of us that you know, have not had the best Agni. That's why this knowledge is so much light in our lives, isn't it? Because we're like, wow, it really helps us a lot. You might notice that if certain situations are not controlled in your outer circumstances, the chronic Agni problems end up coming back. So that actually leads us to need to control our outer circumstances even more. And that can be debilitating, you know, because that's just feeding more and more control. So working on the more subtle aspects that affect mind also help to heal other areas of health, including happiness hormones, energy levels, sleep, relationships, and I should have put etc. there. So working on that subtle layer, you know, if you work on your mind and your prana, they affect everything. So your digestion improves as well as all the other things. Whereas when you work with just the physical aspect of fixing digestion, it, you know, it is good. It does affect everything else, like other things eventually, but not as much as it would with the mind. Okay, just to briefly mention what are the doshas. For those that are new to Ayurveda, I'll put it in a very brief way. This is how I teach it in a very brief way. So Ayurveda understands our whole entire universe, including us, as an amalgamation of the 5 great elements: space, air, fire, water, and earth. And so everybody is like a special, unique recipe of these 5 elements, and we'll have varying amounts of these elements within us, as will different foods, different times of day, etc. And so the way that we understand this interaction of the elements and how they manifest in our body and in the world around us is through the word dosha. Although dosha in its Sanskrit translation is fault, the way that we can understand it with where we are at with our intelligence is that it describes how these elements behave, you could say. So there are 3 doshas in Ayurveda, and they've categorized them with one called Vata, which is the air and the ether element effect, one called Pitta, which is the effect of water and fire, and Kapha, which is the effect of water and earth. And so the word dosha doesn't literally mean effect or anything like that. This is just the way that we can understand it. So when you hear the word dosha, it's basically, though it'll be one of those 3, Vata, Pitta, or Kapha, and it'll be describing the effect of those particular elements that belong to each dosha. So people mostly understand it very quickly as Vata, air, Pitta, fire, and Kapha as water. But Kapha is water and earth. Pitta is fire and water, although the water element doesn't show itself as much because the fire dominates. And Vata is air and ether. Right, let's talk about Ayurvedic psychological and physiological profiles and how they can impact our digestion. So when we say Ayurvedic profiles, what I'm talking about is the constitution. That is the makeup of elements that you are, and they describe it as a certain amount of doshas. So let's talk about what each of these doshas are on a psychological level, and then I'll correlate that with how it will impact your digestion. And it's very logical when we understand it. So Ayurvedic psychological profile of Vata. Let's start with Vata, which is the air and ether elements. Psychologically, when we have a lot of these elements, either in our constitution or through an imbalance where we've taken in more of that element through the food, or our actions are creating and generating it, or our environment promotes it. What's going to happen is those qualities of those elements will increase, or there will be more there. So what are those qualities? They are dry, light, cold, subtle, and mobile. So if you want to learn these more in depth, it would, you can learn about each of the qualities of the doshas, but this is the Vata one. So psychologically, what this ends up doing is it creates a personality type that is moving a lot, very subtle. So their mind is able to sense energy quite well. Mobile, moving, restless is a harsh word to call the Vata psychological profile. The mind moves a lot. When it's in flow, it's incredibly creative and powerful. But when the Vata gets blocked, there can be anxiety as well. So when we translate that into the impact it has on our digestion, in Ayurveda, we call people that have a lot of the Vata dosha within them or through an imbalance, they are more likely to have something called a Vishama Agni. So that means the digestion is erratic and it's always changing. So this means, or how we can correlate this with the psychological level, you'll see that they often are too busy and they'll skip meals. They're able to control what they eat and their control of their digestion. And this can be very tricky when something like anorexia is there, or an eating disorder. Their relationship with food won't be as strong. There almost won't be a love of food sometimes. They'll just be eating just to pass, just because they have to eat a little bit and then move on. And what I've noticed is that they will often put aside their preferences of what they want to eat, and they'll go for what they've been told is healthy, what they feel. There can also be a tendency to want light food and dry food, especially. So, nuts and seeds and often cold things. So one of the qualities of the Vata dosha is cold. And so they'll opt for cold things. And all of these things will be affecting their digestion. The issue with having an erratic digestion is that they will never digest their food fully. And this is one of the issues in all of the psychological profiles. And the way that we understand this best is through a gas flame. This is the best way to understand digestion as per Ayurveda. And I'm talking about a gas flame like when we go camping, where the adjustment of the flame can become really big or small, or if you've got a gas stove at home, okay, when you turn the dial, it either becomes really big or really, really low. So to understand this, imagine you've got a pot on your flame or on your stove or your cooker, and there's contents inside that pot. And so those that have Vishama Agni, possibly through excess Vata dosha, that gas flame is going really high and then it's going really low. Hold on a minute, I'll just let someone in. Oh. So that gas flame will be really high and then really low, and then really high and then really low. That's what it means by erratic digestion. So what they'll find is that their digestion can be really strong, and then at other times it's less strong. Bear with me 1 minute. I'm just going to pop the light on in here. And so at the times when the digestion is super high, they'll probably digest their food quite well. But if the digestion is on a low, they won't be digesting as much. Or, what it leads to is that there is a mass or a leftover part of digestion in their stomach contents, and that leads to something called ama, which is toxins in Ayurveda. So something else to follow on from and learn more about when we have time. The second dosha, the pitta dosha. So those that have a lot of pitta dosha, they tend to have a very strong digestion. Their psychology matches that strong fire. They are very focused and good at drive and doing something. And their digestion, and the negative aspect of that psychological profile is when it becomes too much, and it can lead to a little bit of anger, frustration, excess heat in the mind, which generally, leads to things like stress as well. So their digestion is something called tikshna, which is sharp. So if you go back to that gas flame, if you put the food into the pot and the flame is on a full power flame, when the food goes in, it will burn. And that's the toxins that's created from that particular digestion profile matched with their psychology. So basically, where the mind is too sharp, the digestion becomes too sharp. When the mind is moving too much, the digestion also moves too much. Let me just say here what might help us to understand this. So when you are digesting something, it requires awareness. We can only be aware of one thing at a time. It's impossible to be fully aware on several things at one time. So if we want 100% awareness, it has to be on one thing. Awareness is one-pointedness. It's like one thing. It's a bit hard to describe. So when the mind is always jumping and moving, there's no way that our digestion is going to be able to digest food. So, sorry, this is going back to the Vata profile a little bit more. When the mind is moving around too much, the awareness on the digestion is not there. And that's what leads to the issue. With the Pitta dosha, when the mind is too focused and too sharp and too strong, their digestion kind of creates a burning in their body, which creates ama and toxin. Let's talk about the Kapha dosha. So when there's excess Kapha, or if someone is of that particular profile, according to Ayurveda. If we go back to the gas flame, they have a low gas flame. So their digestion is what's called manda, which is, I wouldn't say weak, but you can understand it as a dull digestive fire. So interestingly, they're the ones that choose the more heavy meals, so they can't digest it fully with a low flame. But if you can imagine, you've got your pot, the food is in there. If it's on a really low flame, what happens? It takes a long time to cook, doesn't it? If we're trying to boil water on a really low flame, it takes a long time for it to get to the boiling point. And so their digestion is the same. And so Ayurvedic psychological profile of a Kapha dosha is to match it to the digestion, yes, slow. There is a slowness, but not in a negative way, in a more kind of taking it easy, more steady. However, what I would add is there is a certain stableness to that particular psychological profile, which is, Kapha type people tend to be very steady. Although slow, they're very sustaining in what they do. They don't jump out from it and leave it. And so their digestion, although it is low, it's steady and it stays there. And that's why they are also very regular with their eating. So their digestion tends to be a little bit weak, but steady. And they have the more likely healthier profiles. However, if they overeat Kapha type foods, or if there's an imbalance somewhere and they put too much food onto their digestion, or they have too much water element, that fire of the digestion is likely to be weakened. And that's what leads to kapha type armor forming in their body. Okay, so just to briefly summarize, understand this as the gas flame. Vishama Agni, Tikshna Agni, and Manda Agni. More likely in Vata, Pitta, and Kapha profiles, and it matches how their mind is moving and how steady it is and how sharp their concentration is. Okay, so how does this affect our food choices and how, as well as how we cook and consume them? So we can understand this from firstly the doshas, but secondly we'll talk about sattva, rajas, and tamas. So very quickly, for example, a Vata type person will suffer more from something like anxiety, fear, restlessness. This will affect their food choices. They will want something quick, they'll want something easy, they'll probably want something light as well. And that would actually affect how they're eating it, it will affect their digestion, and it will affect how they cook and consume it, because they're probably going to eat it very quickly, or they might be talking while they're eating or on the move and doing something. So it has a direct link when we actually look at that. Are you... Sorry, hold on a minute. Okay. I thought I heard the door. Okay. Secondly, the Pitta temperament. So like I said, it can lead to things like anger, hate, jealousy. This is on the more negative side, stress. So what that would lead to is choosing the foods that are not best for a Pitta type person. So they'll often opt for spicy food, oily food, sharp food, some like pickles and this kind of fermented foods as well. They can enjoy. Coffee is another one. And so what they'll do is, what I find interesting about the Pitta dosha is that there's a lot of passion in the way that it's cooked. Actually, there's a lot of heat and fire and enjoyment in that. Like, it's very, very passionate. So it's not negative in that sense, but you can see that correlation. And the consumption of it could be like oh, let's really enjoy it, like a real like big meals, and very indulgent, you could say. Their foods will be very indulgent, cheeses and sharp things and wines and rich chocolates, or yeah, like very rich foods can be there. And interestingly, if anybody knows about the condition of gout, it's connected to that type of indulgent food. So gout is a painful buildup of uric acid that builds up in certain places in the body, and it's inflammatory in nature. It's very, very painful, but it's related to excess heat, which is connected to the consumption of indulgent foods. And then kapha psychological temperament. They can be very slow. They're very, very kind in nature, but they will tend to choose more heavy, dense foods, sometimes rich foods, but they won't opt for light, easy to digest choices. And that is exactly correlated to their mind as well. Their minds can become very heavy and dense and almost coagulated. So kapha dosha is deeply connected to, or strongly connected to, emotions because of the water element. So actually they have a deep psychology with emotional eating with kapha type of temperaments, where when they're not able to express their emotions because they're often caring for other people more, it would lead them to consume heavier foods like sugary foods or heavy carbohydrates in filling a void, you could say, of not being able to express themselves. So that's the connection there. Although on a positive note, if we look at how they cook and consume them, Kapha type people love to cook for others. They're very family orientated. They like to have people around, and they consume their food, with people. They're not people to eat alone and silently. They'll probably enjoy, a conversation, caring for someone in a family setting, sharing what they've eaten. And it's normally very comfort food as well, what they're going to make. So moving beyond blanket statements for mental health, such as avoiding stress and eating in a calm environment. So when we are learning about Agni, you will notice that we kind of put that as just at the end, like, oh yeah, for your Agni, make sure that you eat in a quiet place and don't eat in a bad mood, or, the classic things. And honestly, in reality, it's not as easy as that, is it? To just say, okay, I'm just going to make sure that stress isn't there. If we wanted to really avoid stress, we would avoid it. Sometimes it's unavoidable, and sometimes eating in a calm environment is not possible. If you've got kids running around, if you're at work, in a workplace or in a busy city center, you can't apply these principles of better eating and better digestion by a blanket statement like that. So although they are true, they're a little bit weak standing if we really want to understand mental health and the impact of it on our digestion. We've got to move beyond things like this, because you can avoid all the stress in your life and eat in a quiet room by yourself. But if your internal world is reeling with thoughts, then what do you do? Okay, so we can't attribute our mental health only to our outer circumstances. There is a whole inner environment of thoughts that we are thinking about whilst we are eating. And so how do we do that? How do we start working in making sure that our inner mind, our inner self, is free from those constant thoughts? And this goes back to understanding mental digestion. So in Ayurveda, this is an important thing to learn, the fact that we have a mental digestion as well as a physical. So this has just reminded me, I didn't talk about sattva, rajas, and tamas in one of the previous statements, but we can talk about it now. So in Ayurveda, there is a mental constitution that we have, not just a physical one. Your mind actually came into this world with a certain amount of something called sattva, rajas, and tamas. So these are the three major gunas, they're called, and they're very, very important when we have to understand mental health. So you can understand sattva, rajas, and tamas as, I would say, rates for the purpose of digestion and food, organization of your energy. And that will relate to your thoughts too. So let's go with tamas, the most heaviest guna. This is a state of energy or movement or organization of energy as very slow and heavy and almost static, almost not fully static, but the most static it could be. So when tamas is in the mind, it is going to be more heavy thoughts, more slow thoughts. Tamas is also related to more darkness of the mind. So depression, addiction follows all of it. More heavier thoughts, attachment will deeply be rooted in tamas as well. Rajas is the next guna. That is an organization of energy that is not very organized. It's moving though. So it's a step up in subtlety from tamas, where there's a lot of movement. happening in the mind. So there is a lot there, and there's a lot of movement. So when there's rajas in the mind, we have a lot of thoughts and they're moving a lot. And then you got sattva, which is a quality of organized movement, you could say. It's streaming, it's harmonious, it's flowing, and it's steady. It's not necessarily clear, it's more a harmonious flow. Okay, so your mind will be made up of these three things: sattva, rajas, and tamas. You are born with a certain amount of each of these, depending on your circumstances, your parents, your karma, etc. Over time, you can change these so that you move your mind into more sattva and less tamas. And so when it comes to understanding your mind as per Ayurveda, firstly, you've got your constitution, okay? And then secondly, you've got something called mental digestion. So you are able, there is a process where your mind and your thoughts are digested. So your experiences are digested. So whatever happens to you, there is a digestion process that's happening there. And this happens in the evening time when you're sleeping. That's the best mental digestive time. Although throughout the day, you are also mentally digesting what you're taking in. So there is also a range of strengths of mental digestion depending on your level of awareness. If you increase your level of awareness through something like meditation, you will be able to mentally digest things much easier, because awareness is that mental digestive process. Because remember, Agni is also awareness. So when it comes to thoughts and experiences, when we place awareness onto them through sitting with them, through meditation, we start to digest them. And so working towards a healthy mental digestion and working towards a sattva guna will help us to purify our inner state so that we really create certain space within us in order to affect the mind and to affect the digestion as well. So you can do this through learning about mental digestion, which is available on the free e-read that I've released this month. You can also do this with something called japa. That for those that know this, it's a meditation technique of chanting, and it purifies the mind. So if you want to know more about that, you can get in touch with me. But it's basically, it takes the energy away from your subconscious thoughts into the mantra as you chant it again and again. So rather than, like, it's not some kind of antidote that gets rid of the thoughts, it's every time the thought comes, you move your attention to the mantra. So if you put less energy onto those thoughts, they don't have as much power. Okay, so the more you keep thinking about something, you're feeding it and feeding it and feeding it. So it becomes a certain practice for when you recognize a negative thought to say, no, om, and you start doing the japa. You're moving your attention away from those negative thoughts onto the mantra, and it becomes something that you'll have to cultivate over time. And it's very good for clearing the inner space, especially the subconscious mind. The subconscious mind is this library of all our experiences and our thoughts that are there. So japa meditation helps to work through that mindscape. And this is where we can start to tackle that inner environment rather than just trying to control the outer environment. And when that inner environment is purified, or it's that, you know, it's more controlled, and you're able to digest your thoughts and experiences as they're happening, then it actually doesn't matter what's happening around you. This is the power of sadhana, of meditation, of the yogic practices, is that you gain mastery over your inner self, so that no matter what happens on the outside, whatever circumstances you're facing, they can also be even joyful, you remain in your center and you remain there. And so we are less affected because we are less attached to what's happening around us. Prana. Okay, prana is really big, actually, in all of what we learn about the mind, the body, everything. In the Upanishads, prana is the biggest thing to worship. That we are nothing without prana. It's the force of life that's moving through us, and it's moving every cell in our body. It's moving the blood around our body. It's moving the thoughts around our mind. It's digesting our food. It's doing everything. Without our prana, we are nothing. So if we specifically hone in on our digestion, there is something called the samana prana, and that's a splitting action in the digestion. And so when we strengthen that, the digestion works a lot better. Once we strengthen the samana vayu, all the other pranas in the body, there's 4 other big ones, they all come into balance. When your 5 pranas are in balance, your body and your mind function on par. Okay, so each of these pranas have different directions of movement. And each of these pranas are responsible for certain processes in the body and certain psychological effects on the mind as well. When they are in balance, our body and our mind do its thing. We don't have to do anything, actually. Our body is designed to be healthy. That's how we are. If we just let the prana do what it needs to do, it will keep us healthy. It will keep us alive. It's us that tends to intervene with it. But when it comes to digestion, the samana prana is the main one to work on. And any yogic practice working on the core will be strengthening the samana vayu. So that's anything around the core area, whether it be asana movement, pranayama exercises, certain bandhas, certain mudras, anything that works on that area will be strengthening that samana vayu, which will strengthen your digestion. But having a knowledge of prana and practicing how to gather more of it in your life, understanding it more, will help. Okay, and lastly, just to end off, looking at the deeper purpose of eating food and the spiritual aspects to consider in our relationship with food. So what I meant by this was, why are we eating? Why am I eating this plate of food? And you might say, well, I feel hungry. But there is such a deep, more esoteric aspect to that eating the food. You say, I need to eat food. Okay, why do you need to eat food? Because I'm hungry. Okay, and it keeps you alive. So why are you alive? What is it that keeps you moving? Why do you want to eat food and keep sustaining yourself? What is the purpose of sustaining your physical body? And so then that leads us on to a deeper inquiry about what is life, basically. You know, food is so primal, isn't it? It's our basic need of every human, no matter how evolved on the path that you are. Everybody needs to eat food. Well, there are some yogis that work with prana. Ooh, just gonna mute. Yes, so I first came to this when I think I was learning about the teachings of Krishna on the ISKCON way of learning. I think I was reading Srila Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita, and it very beautifully explains how we are just a tiny part of the greater whole, or we can understand as Krishna. So if you can imagine Krishna's like this bigger thing, and we are we think that we are everything, but actually we are just the, I don't know, the finger part of Krishna, you could say. So our existence is just a spark of a greater entity, what we understand as God, you could say. So when we are eating food, we are not actually digesting that food. But there was a line from it. Hang on a minute. Let me see if I can bring it up. It's gone. Hang on. It's gone. It was something, when it comes up, I'll try to post it online. It's something like, it's not me that's digesting the food. When it comes back, I'll share it. But it really helps you to it's a little bit of a riddle, but it helps you to understand that when we're eating food, we are not feeding ourselves. There we go. That's a better way to put it. We are eating that food for that divinity to be able to work through us, through our physical body. So whenever we come to food and we eat food, it's good to remember that I'm eating this to sustain my body so that the divine is able to work through me. And so depending on what we consume through that understanding, we'll have the divine working through us more easily or with more difficulty. So if we eat light sattvic food, that divine energy will be able to work through us more easily. Whereas when we consume more dark and heavy food, it's less likely that energy can move through us. So the spiritual aspect of eating food, I think it's very beautiful, actually, because you realize that you're not consuming the food for your own satisfaction and a pleasing of your senses. So we're moving beyond that, like, I'm eating for my own pleasure. So when we eat for the purpose of being able to serve, it doesn't mean that we have to suffer. We can still enjoy the food that we eat. We don't have to eat foods that are necessarily bland and tasteless. We can still have a variety of tastes, as we learn in Ayurveda. To embrace all of Mother Nature's gifts through food and understand that, to appreciate it. Okay, so that will change the relationship to the food completely. And if you know what prasad is, that's when you offer the food to that divinity. So I suppose that's the same thing. You know, before you eat the food, you understand that I'm not feeding myself here. I'm feeding the body to be able to fulfill my dharma, to help me to serve, so that my body can be sustained for that purpose. And that changes our entire relationship to what we eat and how we eat. And then layered onto that is sattva, rajas, and tamas. So everything that we've spoken about today, it all kind of interlinks together. So this was just a kind of a whistle-stop tour of what we are. Actually, let me put the outline. This is just a whistle-stop tour of some things that we can think about to expand our understanding of what affects our digestion. And just to close off the session, just as a reminder, that most subtle aspect, that spiritual light, will be that original flame of digestion. And then the next layers are the prana and the mind. So if you work on your spiritual practice and your connection to the divine, you're helping your digestion the most, I would say. And then you've got the mind and the prana. If you work on those, you're again impacting your digestion on a huge level. And then after that, you can look at perhaps your lifestyle choices, depending on your particular dosha and what foods that you're choosing. And then from there, you might be able to say, okay, here are a little bit of my diet restrictions. I take a few of these herbs to support my digestion based off of that. So you can see that, you know, the herbs and the diet are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to our digestion. There is a huge amount underneath that we can do that will help it along. And it doesn't only improve our digestion, it improves our entire life. When you work with prana and the mind, you change your hormones, you change your flow of blood, everything. And if we work on the spiritual aspects, our whole attitude to life and happiness is improved through that. Okay, I hear a little baby downstairs, so I better get back to feeding. Thank you very much, everybody. So for those that are watching the recording, thank you very much. I'll close the recording now. If you want any more information or questions, please reach out. We can have a consultation, or just look out for some of my offerings that I'm going to be having on this month and across the year, where we'll be able to go into these in more detail. So I'll just stop the recording.